Winter, 1943. Deep in the frozen heart of the Soviet Union, behind layers of military secrecy and snow-covered barriers, something extraordinary was about to happen. Inside a weapons testing range 40 kilometers outside Moscow, a group of Red Army officers gathered around two submachine guns that would change everything they thought they knew about firepower, engineering, and the brutal reality of modern warfare. One weapon was a symbol of German precision engineering, the MP40, captured from fallen Wehrmacht soldiers on the blood-soaked battlefields of Stalingrad. Sleek, elegant, with clean lines and mechanical sophistication that spoke of decades of Germanic weapon-making tradition. The other was the PPSh-41, the Soviet Union's own crude-looking beast of stamped steel and rough wood, mass-produced in factories that had been evacuated under artillery fire, assembled by workers who had never held a gun before the war began. Before we dive deep into this unbelievable story that reveals the shocking truth about what really wins wars, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you think elegant engineering or brutal simplicity wins in real combat. This isn't just another weapons comparison. This is the story of how ideology, desperation, and raw Soviet determination created a weapon that German soldiers feared more than artillery, and how a single afternoon of testing revealed a truth that military strategists had been blind to for generations. The date was February 17, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad had just ended weeks earlier with the complete destruction of the German Sixth Army, and the tide of the Eastern Front was beginning its irreversible turn. But in the halls of Soviet military command, questions lingered like smoke after battle. German weapons had earned a fearsome reputation. The MP40, nicknamed the Schmeisser by Allied troops, despite Hugo Schmeisser having nothing to do with its design, was considered by many Western military observers to be the finest submachine gun in the world. Its folding stock, its precision manufacturing, its controlled rate of fire, everything about it screamed superiority. Soviet generals had seen their own troops discard PPSh-41s to pick up captured MP40s, believing the German weapon to be more reliable, more accurate, more deadly. This belief had spread like a virus through the ranks, threatening the very foundation of Soviet small arms doctrine. So the order came down from the highest levels of command. Conduct a comprehensive, no-holds-barred comparison test. Strip away propaganda from both sides. Find the truth, whatever it might be, about which weapon truly dominated the close-quarters hell of urban and winter warfare. The testing range was a harsh place even by Soviet standards. Temperatures hovered around -23 degrees Celsius. Snow lay thick on the ground, and a bitter wind swept across the open fields where targets had been, arranged at various distances. The testing committee consisted of 7 men, 3 senior officers from the main artillery directorate, 2 weapons engineers from the Shpagin factory where the PPSh-41 was produced, and 2 frontline combat veterans who had personally used both weapons in the apocalyptic fighting at Stalingrad. These were not academics playing with theories. These were men who understood that the results of today's test would determine policy decisions affecting millions of soldiers, that lives hung in the balance of whatever truth emerged from the gunsmoke and frozen air. The lead officer, Colonel Dmitry Petrov, was a man whose entire career had been built on Germanic admiration. He had studied in German military academies before the war, had translated German weapons manuals, and had openly advocated for Soviet adoption of German design principles. He looked at the PPSh-41 with barely concealed contempt. This weapon represented everything he despised about Soviet industrial crudeness. To him it was an embarrassment, a symbol of backwardness, proof that the Soviet Union still lagged generations behind true military powers. Standing opposite him, quiet and unassuming, was the weapon's creator, Georgy Shpagin. He was 51 years old, a man who had spent his entire life in factories and workshops, who had never attended a prestigious university or studied under famous weapon designers. His hands were calloused and scarred from decades of metalwork. He wore a simple worker's jacket, not a military uniform, and he had arrived at the testing range on a military truck, sitting in the back with enlisted men rather than demanding officers' quarters. Everything about Shpagin spoke of humility and practicality. He had designed the PPSh-41 not in some sterile laboratory, but on the factory floor, surrounded by the deafening noise of production machinery, thinking constantly about one question: how do you arm 5 million soldiers when your country is being overrun and your factories are being evacuated eastward under bomber attack? His answer had been the PPSh-41, a weapon that could be produced by semi-skilled workers using stamped metal parts, that required minimal machining, that could be assembled quickly and cheaply, and that prioritized reliability over elegance. The Soviet High Command had approved it out of desperation in 1941, when the Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow and conventional manufacturing had collapsed. Now, 2 years later, over 2 million had been produced, but questions about its true effectiveness persisted. Colonel Petrov examined the two weapons laid out on the testing table with the air of a man who had already reached his conclusions. The MP40 gleamed even in the pale winter light, its metal surfaces precisely machined, its folding stock clicking into place with satisfying mechanical precision, its magazine well perfectly aligned. It weighed just under 9 pounds unloaded, felt, balanced in the hands, and had a rate of fire around 500 rounds per minute, fast enough to be devastating in close quarters, but controlled enough for accurate burst fire. German military doctrine emphasized precision, and the MP40 embodied that philosophy. It was a weapon for trained soldiers, for men who had spent months on rifle ranges, who understood fire discipline and ammunition conservation. Petrov smiled as he handled it. This, he thought, was what a proper weapon should be. Then, he turned to the PPSh-41, and his expression soured. The Soviet weapon was heavier, over 12 pounds loaded with its massive 71-round drum magazine. Its wooden stock was rough, sometimes showing tool marks from hasty production. Its stamped steel components looked crude compared to the MP40's machined elegance. The barrel shroud had perforations that seemed almost random, and the overall aesthetic was one of brutal functionality rather than refined design. Petrov hefted it with distaste. To him, this weapon represented Soviet inferiority, the triumph of quantity over quality, proof that Russian engineering still belonged in the 19th century rather than the 20th. But Georgy Shpagin watched in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing. He had heard these criticisms 1,000 times before, from military officials who had never fired a shot in combat, from engineers trained in the old Tsarist academies who sneered at anything that didn't conform to Western, European design standards, from officers who equated precision manufacturing with battlefield effectiveness. He said nothing because he knew something they didn't. He had spent hundreds of hours talking to frontline soldiers, to men who fought in the frozen forests of the north and the burning ruins of Stalingrad's factories, to tank crews and reconnaissance units and punishment battalions. He had listened to their stories of weapons jamming in the cold, of magazines that cracked in sub-zero temperatures, of intricate mechanisms that failed when clogged with mud or dust. He had designed the PPSh-41 based on those stories, based on the real conditions of the Eastern Front, rather than the theoretical conditions of peacetime rifle ranges. And now, finally, his weapon would speak for itself. The test protocol was comprehensive and brutal. First, accuracy testing at 50, 100, and 200 meters against both stationary and moving targets. Second, sustained fire testing too. Determine how long each weapon could fire before overheating or jamming. Third, reliability testing under adverse conditions. The weapons would be covered in snow, submerged in ice water, packed with frozen mud, and then fired immediately without cleaning. Fourth, ammunition capacity and reload speed comparison. Fifth, ease of maintenance and field stripping under combat conditions. And finally, the subjective assessment of the two combat veterans, who would fire both weapons extensively and render their honest judgment about which they would prefer to carry into battle. The tension in that frozen testing range was palpable, like electricity before a thunderstorm. Everyone present understood that careers hung in the balance, that military doctrine would shift based on these results, that this was no ordinary weapons test, but rather a trial of competing philosophies about warfare, industrial production, and what truly mattered when men killed each other at arm's reach. Colonel Petrov insisted on conducting the first test personally with the MP40. He loaded a 32-round magazine with smooth, practiced movements, shouldered the weapon, and fired a controlled burst at the 50-meter target. The MP40 barked with its distinctive sound, a rapid mechanical chattering that was almost musical in its precision. 5 rounds, grouped tightly in the target's center. Petrov's smile was triumphant. He fired again, another perfect burst. The weapon handled beautifully, with minimal muzzle climb and excellent controllability. At 100 meters, his accuracy remained impressive. At 200 meters, he could still place deliberate single shots near the target center. He turned to Shpagin with unconcealed satisfaction. This is how a modern weapon performs. Controlled, precise, professional. Your PPSh fires like a farmer's tool, all noise and wasted ammunition. The other officers nodded in agreement. The German weapon's superiority seemed self-evident. The two combat Veterans exchanged glances but remained silent, their expressions carefully neutral. They had seen something that Petrov had missed, something subtle but crucial. The MP40's magazine had already been changed 3 times during the demonstration. The 32-round capacity meant constant reloading, and while Petrov was an excellent marksman under range conditions, they wondered how those frequent magazine changes would play out in the chaos of actual combat. Now it was time for the PPSh-41. One of the combat veterans, Sergeant Mikhail Antonov, stepped forward. He was 26 years old but looked 40, with a face carved by frostbite and shrapnel scars. He had fought at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk. He had killed more men in close combat than he could remember, and he had survived situations that killed 90% of the men around him. He picked up the PPSh-41 with the familiarity of long association, checked the 71-round drum magazine, and chambered a round. Then, he simply opened fire. The difference was immediately, viscerally apparent. The PPSh roared with a rate of fire nearly twice that of the MP40, 900 rounds per minute compared to 500, a sustained mechanical thunder that echoed across the frozen landscape like approaching artillery. Antonov swept the 50-meter targets, then the 100-meter targets, maintaining continuous fire. The drum magazine allowed him to sustain fire for 8 full seconds before running dry. An eternity in combat, long enough to suppress an entire enemy squad, to cover a tactical movement, to break an enemy assault with pure firepower. When he finally stopped shooting, smoke rose from the barrel shroud in wispy columns. The targets at 50 meters were shredded. The targets at 100 meters were thoroughly perforated. Even at 200 meters, where accuracy dropped significantly, the sheer volume of fire had riddled the target area. Colonel Petrov's expression shifted from confidence to irritation. Rate of fire means nothing without accuracy. You've wasted ammunition. In a real combat situation, such indiscipline would leave you defenseless. But Sergeant Antonov's response was quiet and devastating. With respect, Colonel, I was in the barricade factory in Stalingrad when the Germans came. They were 50 meters away, sometimes closer, fighting room to room, floor to floor. I needed firepower that wouldn't quit, that could sweep an entire doorway or hallway, that would keep shooting when there was no time to aim carefully. The MP40 is excellent for a soldier on a parade ground. The PPSh is excellent for a soldier who wants to survive the next 5 minutes of hell. The silence that followed was deafening. The other combat veteran nodded slowly in agreement. Even some of the officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the truth in Antonov's words. But Petrov was not ready to concede. We haven't tested reliability yet. German engineering is legendary for reliability. Let's see how your crude Soviet weapon performs under real conditions. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Soviet military circles, told and retold in officers' clubs and veterans' gatherings for decades afterward. The testing crew took both weapons and deliberately subjected them to the kind of treatment that weapons received on the actual Eastern Front. First, they buried both guns completely in snow and left them for 20 minutes in the upping -23-degree cold. Then they retrieved them, brushed off the excess snow without any cleaning or maintenance, and attempted to fire them immediately. Petrov confidently picked up the MP40, aimed at a target, and pulled the trigger. Click, nothing. He cycled the action manually and tried again. The bolt moved sluggishly, frozen condensation having formed in the weapon's precisely machined internal mechanisms. He managed to fire a single round, then the weapon jammed completely, the bolt frozen halfway back. His face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The German engineers who had designed the MP40 had created a masterpiece of mechanical precision. But that very precision was its weakness. Tight tolerances meant that ice, mud, or dust could halt its operation. Sergeant Antonov picked up the PPSh-41, brushed the snow from its crude exterior, and immediately fired a full burst. The weapon roared to life without hesitation, spitting fire and spent casings into the snow. The officers stared in shocked silence. The testing continued with increasing brutality. They submerged both weapons in ice-cold water for 5 minutes, simulating river crossings or fighting in winter marshes. The MP40 required extensive cleaning and drying before it would function again. The PPSh-41 was pulled from the water, shaken once to clear the barrel, and fired immediately, still perfectly functional. They packed both weapons with frozen mud, the kind of clinging heavy sludge that covered soldiers and equipment during the spring thaw. The MP40's folding stock mechanism jammed open. The magazine well became clogged. The precisely fitted components refused to move. The PPSh-41, with its loose tolerances and simple stamped components, was field stripped in under 30 seconds. The mud was cleared with bare hands, and the weapon was reassembled and firing again in under 2 minutes. With each successive test, Colonel Petrov's confident facade crumbled a little more. His worldview, built on decades of Germanic admiration and faith in precision engineering, was being systematically demolished by reality. The weapon he had scorned as crude and backwards was proving superior in every practical measure that mattered in actual combat. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Georgy Shpagin finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the frozen testing range. "Colonel Petrov, may I ask you a question?" Petrov, still struggling with the frozen MP40, nodded curtly. "How long does it take to produce one MP40 in a German factory?" Petrov frowned, uncertain where this was leading. "Approximately 18 hours of skilled machining labor, plus the time required for the precision components." Shpagin nodded slowly. "And how many trained machinists are required?" "At least 3 to 4 skilled workers, plus quality control inspectors and assembly technicians." "And the cost in raw materials?" Petrov consulted his notes. "Approximately 3 kilograms of high-quality machined steel plus aluminum alloys for certain components." Shpagin's weathered face remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes now, a quiet intensity that made everyone listen more carefully. "The PPSh-41 requires 5 hours and 20 minutes to produce from raw materials to finished weapon. It can be assembled by workers with less than 1 week of training, many of them women and teenagers because our men are at the front. It uses stamped steel, components that can be produced on simple presses, and it requires only 1.8 kilograms of steel. A single factory in Moscow is currently producing 3,000 PPSh-41s per week. To match that production with MP40s would require 3 times the labor, 5 times the skilled workers, and twice the raw materials." The implications hit the assembled officers like a physical blow. Warfare was not just about which weapon performed better on a pristine testing range. It was about which weapon you could actually get into the hands of millions of soldiers when your country was being invaded, when your factories were being evacuated under bomber attack, when your skilled workers were being conscripted into the army. Colonel Petrov opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time in his career, he was confronting a truth that shattered his fundamental assumptions about warfare and technology. But Shpagin wasn't finished. He gestured to the PPSh-41, still lying in the snow where Antonov had left it. "Pick it up, Colonel. Not as an officer evaluating specifications, but as a soldier who needs to survive. Feel its weight. That weight is ammunition, 71 rounds compared to 32. That crude appearance is simplicity. It can be field stripped and reassembled by a conscript with 3 days of training, in the dark, under fire. Those loose tolerances that offend your engineering sensibilities are what keep it shooting when it's covered in frost and mud and the blood of your comrades. I didn't design this weapon to win engineering awards or impress foreign observers. I designed it to win a war." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a bayonet. The other officers were watching Colonel Petrov closely, waiting to see how he would respond to this quiet but devastating challenge. Petrov stood frozen, his carefully constructed worldview collapsing around him. Then, slowly, something extraordinary happened. His face, which had been rigid with pride and defensiveness, began to crack. His shoulders sagged slightly. He walked over to where the PPSh-41 lay in the snow, bent down and picked it up. He held it for a long moment, really feeling its weight, examining its crude stamped components and rough finish with new eyes. When he looked up, his expression had completely transformed. "I have been a fool," he said quietly. And the admission cost him everything. His pride, his certainty, his sense of superiority. "I have spent my entire career worshipping German engineering, believing that precision and elegance were the measures of military effectiveness. I looked at this weapon and saw only crudeness because I was evaluating it by the wrong standards. I was thinking like a peacetime engineer, not like a wartime survivor." He turned to Shpagin, and something remarkable happened in that frozen moment. The proud colonel, with all his German academy training and his decades of military prestige, extended his hand to the humble factory worker. "Comrade Shpagin, I apologize. To you and to every soldier who has relied on your weapon, while officers like me questioned its worth. You understood something I did not, that in total war, the perfect weapon is not the one that performs best under ideal conditions, but the one that performs adequately under the worst conditions, and that can be produced in sufficient quantities to arm an entire nation." Shpagin took his hand, his weathered face showing the faintest hint of a smile. "No apology necessary, Colonel. You asked the right question today. You sought the truth, regardless of your preconceptions. That takes courage, too. The other officers were silent, absorbing this extraordinary moment. Several of them looked at the PPSh-41 with new understanding, seeing past its crude exterior to the brilliant design philosophy beneath. But Sergeant Antonov, the combat veteran, had one more truth to share. Colonel, if I may speak freely. Petrov nodded. On the Stalingrad front, we captured hundreds of MP40s from dead Germans. At first, soldiers fought over them, believing them to be superior weapons. But after a few weeks of combat, something changed. The Germans started picking up our PPSh-41s from dead Soviet soldiers. We found German bodies clutching Papashas, with abandoned MP40s lying nearby. At first we thought they were just scavenging ammunition, but then we captured a German NCO from the 227th Infantry Division who told us the truth. He said, "Your weapon never stops shooting. Ours jams when we need it most. In close combat, your crude gun beats our precise gun every time." The man actually cried when we took his captured PPSh away. This revelation stunned everyone present. The German soldiers, whose weapons had been held up as the pinnacle of military technology, were abandoning them in favor of the crude Soviet weapon that officers like Petrov had scorned. It was the ultimate validation of Shpagin's design philosophy, confirmed not by engineers in testing labs, but by soldiers desperate to survive. Now Shpagin shared something even more profound, something that revealed the true genius behind his design. When I was designing this weapon in 1940, I visited a tank factory in Leningrad. I watched workers assembling T-34 tanks, and I noticed something that changed my entire approach to weapon design. The assembly line workers were teenagers and women, many working their first factory job. They were producing complex war machines under incredible time pressure, and they made mistakes constantly. But the T-34 design was so simple, so forgiving, that many of those mistakes didn't matter. The tank still worked. That's when I understood what Soviet weapons needed to be. Not just functional, but forgiving of mistakes in production, maintenance, and use. The PPSh-41's loose tolerances aren't a flaw, they're a feature. The stamped components aren't crude, they're genius. They can be produced quickly and they work even when slightly deformed or damaged. Every aspect of this weapon was designed with one question in mind. Will it keep shooting when everything around it has gone to hell? He paused, looking at each officer in turn. The Germans designed the MP40 for their army, highly trained, well-supplied professional soldiers. I designed the PPSh-41 for our reality. Millions of conscripts with minimal training, fighting in the worst conditions imaginable, supplied by factories evacuated under fire, maintained in frozen trenches without proper tools. Different circumstances require different solutions. The MP40 is an excellent weapon for the wrong war. Colonel Petrov stood in the snow holding the PPSh-41, and understanding flooded through him like a revelation. For the first time he grasped what total war truly meant, what it demanded of both soldiers and the weapons they carried. The Eastern Front wasn't a gentleman's conflict between professional armies. It was an apocalyptic struggle between entire nations, where industrial capacity and sheer resilience mattered more than technical sophistication. The Wehrmacht had invaded with superior training, better tactics, and more advanced technology. But the Soviet Union was winning through brutal pragmatism, through weapons like the PPSh-41 that embodied a completely different philosophy of warfare. He thought of the millions of Soviet soldiers, many of them peasants who had never seen a machine more complex than a tractor before. The war. Who were armed with these crude-looking but incredibly effective weapons. He thought of the factories producing them by the thousands, of the stamping presses running 24 hours a day, of the teenage workers assembling them with minimal training. And he finally understood that this was the true strength of the Soviet war effort. Not sophistication, but scalability. But the story doesn't end with understanding. It ends with transformation. Over the following months, Colonel Petrov became one of the PPSh-41's most vocal advocates in military command circles. He wrote detailed reports on the testing results, arguing passionately for abandoning the pursuit of German-style precision in favor of Soviet-style pragmatism. He visited frontline units to document how soldiers actually used the weapon in combat. He even visited Shpagin's factory to better understand the production process. His conversion was complete, from skeptic to believer, from Germanic admirer to Soviet pragmatist. But more importantly, he began applying the lessons learned from the PPSh-41 to other areas of Soviet military technology. He argued for simpler tank designs, more reliable artillery, radios that conscripts could operate without extensive training. His reports influenced Soviet military doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The humble factory worker had changed the mind of the proud officer, and in doing so had changed the course of Soviet military thinking. Years later, in 1945, after the war had ended with Soviet victory, Shpagin and Petrov met again at a weapons conference in Moscow. By this point, over 6 million PPSh-41s had been produced, making it one of the most prolific weapons in human history. It had been used in every major Soviet offensive from Stalingrad to Berlin. German soldiers had feared it, respected it, and frequently captured it for their own use. Its distinctive sound had become synonymous with Soviet assault troops, and yet Shpagin remained as humble as ever, uncomfortable with the medals and honors that had been bestowed upon him. Petrov approached him with genuine warmth. "Comrade Shpagin, I wanted to thank you personally for the lesson you taught me that day in the snow. You showed me that true engineering genius isn't about creating the most sophisticated solution, but about creating the right solution for the actual problem. You taught me that humility isn't weakness, and that simplicity isn't inferiority. Those lessons changed my career and possibly saved my life, because I stopped obsessing over German designs and started thinking like a Soviet soldier needed to think." Shpagin shook his hand, smiling. "And you taught me something too, Colonel. You showed me that even the proudest man can admit when he's wrong, and that intellectual courage matters as much as physical courage. Not everyone can question their fundamental beliefs and change their mind based on evidence. That takes real strength. PPSh-41's story is more than just a tale of weapon design. It's a parable about the nature of effectiveness, the danger of assumptions, and the triumph of pragmatism over ideology. In a conflict where the Soviet Union was outmatched in almost every conventional measure of military power, weapons like the PPSh-41 leveled the field through sheer practical genius. While German engineers crafted masterpieces of precision that required skilled workers and careful maintenance, Soviet engineers crafted weapons that could be mass-produced by semi-skilled labor and maintained by soldiers with minimal training. While the Wehrmacht's supply chain struggled to provide replacement parts for complex weapons, Soviet soldiers carried weapons that could be repaired with basic tools and spare parts cannibalized from damaged guns. The PPSh-41 wasn't just a weapon, it was a philosophy made manifest, a statement about what matters when nations fight for survival. It said, reliability matters more than accuracy, volume of fire matters more than precision, mass production matters more than individual quality, and simplicity matters more than sophistication. But perhaps the most powerful lesson from that day in 1943 is about humility and the courage to change. Colonel Petrov could have clung to his beliefs, dismissed the test results, and continued advocating for Germanic design principles. Instead, he did something far more difficult. He admitted he was wrong, publicly and completely. He allowed evidence to change his fundamental worldview. In doing so, he became a more effective officer, a better strategic thinker, and ultimately a man who contributed to Soviet victory rather than hindering it through ideological rigidity. Georgy Shpagin, on the other hand, showed that true genius often comes from the most unlikely places, not from prestigious universities or famous design bureaus, but from factory floors and workshops, from men who listen to soldiers rather than academics, who prioritize function over form, who understand that the best solution is the one that works under the worst conditions. His humility wasn't weakness. It was wisdom born from understanding that weapons exist to serve soldiers, not to impress engineers. Today, more than 80 years after that frozen afternoon near Moscow, the PPSh-41 remains an icon of World War II. Museums display it as a symbol of Soviet industrial might. Video games feature its distinctive sound. Military historians study it as a case study in pragmatic weapon design. But its deepest legacy is the lesson it taught about questioning assumptions, embracing simplicity, and understanding that effectiveness is always context-dependent. In our own lives, we constantly face the choice between the MP40 and the PPSh-41, between sophisticated solutions that look impressive but fail under pressure, and simple solutions that seem crude but actually work. We face the choice between clinging to our preconceptions like Colonel Petrov initially did, or having the humility to change our minds when confronted with evidence. We face the choice between designing for ideal conditions or designing for reality as it actually exists. The PPSh-41 tells us that sometimes the rough, simple, unglamorous solution is the right one, that sometimes the conventional wisdom is wrong, that sometimes the humble factory worker understands warfare better than the decorated officer, and that sometimes the crude-looking thing is actually the brilliant thing once you understand its true purpose. If this story moved you, If it made you question your own assumptions about what makes something truly effective, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe for more untold stories from history that reveal profound truths about human nature, warfare, and the power of humility. Comment below and tell me about a time when you discovered that the simple solution was actually the best solution, or when you had to admit you were completely wrong about something important. Remember, effectiveness isn't about sophistication, it's about fit between design and purpose. The strongest position isn't stubbornness, it's the willingness to change when confronted with truth. And sometimes, the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. From a humble factory worker standing in the snow, holding a crude weapon that would help win the greatest war in human history. The COIZI. PPSh-41 teaches us that in war, as in life, what matters isn't how sophisticated you appear, but whether you're still shooting when everything around you has frozen, jammed, or collapsed. Be like the Papasha, simple, reliable, unstoppable, and built to endure when everyone else has quit. That's the real path to victory.